It's incumbent upon me to begin by acknowledging that the paper I'm about to read is actually co-authored with a friend of mine. Some of you may have seen Professor John Nemec present in this series last year, and it was as a result of him coming here in our discussions on the off time that he was pointing me to certain stories that he had read that he thought I might find interesting in the text that I'm about to talk about. And so after having discussed that, I said, essentially, dude, we should write a paper together, and the result is what I'm about to read today. So I hope to finish in 40-ish, 45 minutes, and leave some time for questions and answers. Legal history in medieval India poses a challenge because direct, datable evidence for legal practice is only found in scattered fragments. Very little legislation survives, most likely because it was not a significant way to make law. Records of trials, disputes, or judicial activities are sometimes preserved, but mostly from a relatively recent date, after around 1500 AD or so. As a result, not enough is known about the ways law functioned in India prior to the colonial period, about how it was understood and engaged by those who dealt with it, or about how law developed during major political, social, economic, and religious transformations. The purpose of this essay is to take a different approach toward filling this lacuna in our understanding of the practice of law by examining literary works, mostly datable, written in Sanskrit. While we are not the first to explore, you'll notice the we throughout, while we are not the first to explore the theme of law in Sanskrit narrative literature or even the particular works in question, new conclusions about the practice of law may be drawn from the sources when they are read as evidence of legal consciousness. The study of legal consciousness, quote, traces the ways in which law is experienced and interpreted by specific individuals as they engage, avoid, or resist the law and legal meanings. Legal consciousness then refers in a general sense to a basic awareness of the substance and procedures of law in some group, whether of ordinary people or of legal specialists. More specifically, legal consciousness can refer to an awareness or lack of awareness of the inequitable and power-reinforcing gap between the rules of law and the practice of law. And by extension, it indicates the unconscious toleration of that gap due to ideological or structural factors in society. The study of legal consciousness in this more specific sense carries with it a program of analyzing and potentially unmasking the ideology or structure that prevents a liberating consciousness of law's processes and effects to merge. If you don't understand it, you can't play the game well. In other words, legal consciousness in its specific meaning serves as a diagnostic concept that may be employed in the investigation of both the circumstances in which people come to possess a thorough grasp of law and legal processes, and those in which people are unaware or resistant or even resigned to the dynamics and indeed the hegemony of the law as it affects them. In this study, we rely on both notions of legal consciousness to investigate some examples of narrative literature from medieval India that reveal, in our view, both the general awareness of substantive law and legal procedures and the power-inflected representations of a consciousness of the law that sometimes tolerates and sometimes challenges discrepancies between rule and practice. Our primary evidence consists of a series of stories that were composed in the Kashmir Valley in the 11th and 12th centuries, but that circulated widely in India and beyond. We're acutely aware that the legal consciousness depicted in the selected Sanskrit narratives belongs first to the class of literate Brahmins that dominate Sanskrit writing from beginning to end. The works we analyze reassert Brahminical privilege, royal authority, and the other social institutions invested in the self-preservation and reproduction of such privilege and authority. We therefore limit our conclusions accordingly by speaking of the imagined reality possible in the depictions of legal consciousness made by this group. Nevertheless, the evidence of legal consciousness examined here challenges extreme views of currency among some scholars of Indian law, either that India had no law in the proper sense, or that law in India was radically, quote, culture-specific, both views tending to prohibit comparison of any sort. Quite the contrary, the texts offer clear evidence of a robust and widespread awareness of law and legalism in medieval India, even if that system of law is portrayed as dependent on the authority of the judge or the king himself. In other words, we argue against Robert Lingat, author of a classic study on India's legal history, that the stories in question reveal the existence of a legal consciousness that recognized both the authority of those who administered the law and the strong sense of legality that those who administered and appealed to the law employed, resisted, or manipulated in complex ways. The first example, and I've taken 5 examples and made them into 2 for the sake of time. We turn first to the Rajatarangini, the River of Kings of Kashmir by Kalhana, a court poet of the Kashmiri king Jayasimha in the 12th century. As is well known, The Rajatarangini is regularly counted as the first explicitly and self-consciously historical work of Sanskrit literature, one written in the Kashmir Valley in this early period. Nevertheless, our analysis seeks to identify the legal consciousness reflected in the narratives here selected and not the historical accuracy of the stories per se. We are interested in how they might have been received by their intended audience and what they can tell us of both the deliberate and unintended representations of legal consciousness when they were written. The first story exemplifies what can be described as an appeal, with the king serving as the final legal authority in a matter that was apparently adjudicated repeatedly and unsuccessfully for the plaintiff. In order to win the attention of the king in this instance, the aggrieved man undertakes a fast unto death, prayopavesha in Sanskrit. So I'm going to read a relatively longish story. This is primarily in Oral Stein's translation, which still holds up after a long period of time with some modifications that we've made. Here's how the story goes. The officers who watched cases of voluntary starvation, that's interesting already that there were officers to do such things, reported a certain person engaged in a fast unto death. When the king had him brought before himself, he spoke. I was once a wealthy citizen here. In the course of time, I became a pauper through the will of fate. When my indebtedness had become great and I was pressed by creditors, I resolved to throw off my debts and to travel about abroad. Thereupon I disposed of all I owned to clear my debts, and sold my own mansion to a rich merchant. From the sale of this great building, I accepted only a well fitted with stairs, having in view the maintenance of my wife. I thought that she would live by the rent given by the gardeners, who at summertime placed flowers, beetle leaves, etc. in that very cool well. After wandering about for 20 years, I have come back from abroad to this my native land with a small fortune. Searching for my wife, I saw that good woman with a wan body living as a servant in other people's houses. When I asked her, distressed, why she had, though provided with a sustenance, taken to such a life, she told her story. When after your departure abroad I went to the well, that merchant drove me away, beating me with cudgels. How could I then otherwise maintain myself? After saying this, she stopped. Hearing this, I fell into the depths of grief and anger. I then began a fast unto death, but somehow the different judges decided against me, giving on each occasion judgment in favor of the defendant. In my simplicity, I do not know the law, but my life I stake for this. I have not sold the well with the stairs. Deprived of my property, I die for certain here at your door. Decide the matter in person, if otherwise you have fear of committing a sin. The king, on being thus addressed by him, proceeded to hold court himself, and after assembling all the judges, inquired into the real facts. The judges spoke to him. This man has been repeatedly dismissed with his claim after due consideration. Full of deceit, he does not respect the law and should be punished as a forger of a written document. Thereupon the king read himself the words as they stood in the deed of the sale. This house is sold together, sahita, with the well fitted with the stairs. Sahita is going to become important in a second. While the counselors cried, from this it is clear he's guilty. But an inner voice of the king, as it were, declared that the claimant was in the right. After apparently reflecting for a moment, the king diverted for a long time the assembled counselors by various other curious stories. In the course of the conversation, he took from all of them their jewels to look at, and with a laugh drew the ring from the defendant's hand. After a while, with a smile, asking all to stay on just for a moment, he retired into another apartment under the pretense of cleaning his feet. From there, he dispatched an attendant with a message to the merchant's house, handing him the ring so that he might be recognized. Showing the ring, this attendant asked the merchant's accountant for the account book of the year in which the deed had been executed. When the accountant was told that the merchant required the book that day in court, he gave it, keeping the ring. In this book, the king read among the items of expenditure an entry of 1,000 dinaras, which had been given to the official recorder. From the fact that such a high fee had been paid to that person, who was entitled only to a small sum for just writing one document, the king knew for certain that the merchant had got him to write a sa for a ra. Sahita means together with, rahita means accepting or without, excluding. He then showed in this assembly, questioned the recorder whom he had brought up under a promise of impunity, and convinced the counselors. At the request of the counselors, the king granted to the claimant the house of the merchant, together with his property, and exiled the defendant from the land. Now, at the heart of this story are common legal concerns, such as forgery, bribery, and judicial appeal, as well as legal concepts specific to law in India, including the judicial wager and the fast unto death. The author weaves several distinguishable legal concerns together to emphasize the complexity of the legal problem facing the king, and therefore the greatness of his achievement in seeing through the tangle of corruption perpetrated by the merchant, the erroneous rulings of the various judges who heard the plaintiff's appeals, and the legal recorder who doctored the deed of sale. In this episode, it is the wise king himself who rectifies the 20-year miscarriage of justice, and it is the Brahmin judges who are portrayed as duped by a manipulation of the trial process. The story therefore amounts to a sort of panegyric that praises the insight of the self-reflective king whose inner voice told him that a fraud had beguiled the judges that preceded him in hearing the complaint. The force of the narrative thus relies on the notion that King Yashaskara was exceptional for exhibiting unusual concern for the interests of an otherwise uninfluential subject. Implied but unstated is the notion that this legal system could be expected regularly to function without too great a regard for the little man, who might be hurt by those who were savvy enough and sufficiently capable to falsify documents and game the system. Notably, there is no question that the law itself is correct. In particular, that a man may forsake his wife if he first pays his debts and provides for her maintenance, and that, somewhat less controversially, that documents of sale are binding. Central to the narrative, then, is a legal consciousness that implicitly accepts the strictures of dharma, whatever injustices they might permit, while simultaneously recognizing that the law in practice is manipulable, often to the harm of those ordinary subjects who are not clever or skilled enough to work the system. The real victim, one might say, the man's wife, is ignored in the king's verdict. Though the man does feel grief and anger for his wife's plight, he seems equally concerned with the fact that his legal wishes were deceitfully left unfulfilled. The silence of the narrative here speaks more forcefully about the legal consciousness represented in the text, and presumably in some measure shared by its audience, than does the major theme recounted in the episode. For the effect of the story, that is to praise Yashaskara, would be undermined if any real concern for the plight of the merchant's wife were felt by the audience. Similarly, the story depicts a criminal accomplice of the story, the legal recorder, the guy who doctored the document, as receiving the medieval equivalent of a plea bargain. It's the first time I found a word for this, by the way, in exchange for testifying against the merchant. The story entirely glosses over the mixed feelings that one would normally expect in such a compromise, again in favor of emphasizing the wisdom of the king as the story's proper resolution. Though the text does not criticize the possible complicity or at least the negligence of the Brahmin judges, they seem at minimum to be unwitting accomplices. But they too go scot-free. Perhaps this is to be expected. No sound legal system could regularly condemn the integrity of a lower court judge for reaching a wrong decision. This would call into question the legitimacy of the lower courts, instead of positively recognizing the importance and justice of a right to appeal. Regardless, the Brahmin judges are depicted as being bound by the letter of the contract that is presented to them, despite the fact that the proof of sale was doctored. This fidelity to the letter of the law, despite the injustice it perpetuated, is precisely the legal conundrum the heroic and wise king is said to overcome. The audience who heard this story must have understood that the law in practice served the interests of those with savvy and with power, and that the system, controlled by legal officers such as Brahmin judges in the story, was hamstrung by legal procedures from rectifying apparent injustices. Even the king uses his guile to seek hard evidence, according to the story, before overturning the ruling that held up repeatedly in the courts, and that he had to, quote, convince the counselors to justify the reversal suggests that the king, with all his authority, nevertheless had to once again adjudicate the legality, however corrupted, of the transaction in order to rectify the injustice. Finally, the manner in which this and similar stories come before the king tells us something about the legal consciousness of the author of the text and the characters he describes. The victim does not find redress through the normal legal channels. The man defrauded of his wealth is rebuffed by the Brahmin judges, who focus only on the visible letter of the deed of sale. The man swindled out of most of his gold coins appeals to the people who witnessed the event, only to be sorry, that's something I should have deleted. In order to pursue his claim, the man had to resort to the threat of suicide by fasting. The classical Sanskrit expression for this, prayopavesha, is mirrored in a number of regional languages, even in the present day. Dharna Dena, thank you, Lalita, Patani in Malayalam and Tamil, and the practice is also narrated in other roughly contemporary Kashmiri works. How should we interpret these mentions of the fast done to death in terms of legal consciousness? On the one hand, this dramatic act simply sets a good stage for the rest of the story. It signals literarily the desperation of the victim and the emotional burden of his plight. On the other hand, it appears also to suggest, if not state explicitly, the potential or real difficulties of finding justice through normal legal process. We are tempted, therefore, to see in this framing of the story a general sense that ordinary legal procedures are rife with injustice, that things are stacked in favor of the powerful. As a result, only an extraordinarily wise and caring king can check the otherwise rampant corruptions of justice done in the name of the law. At this point, we may have in the Rajatarangini at least some criticism of the ideologies and power structures of the law that form part of the more specific legal consciousness in its constitutive relationship to other social forces. Similar then to one powerful view of law in modern America, the victims of legally sanctioned justice in the River of Kings, quote, feel virtually incapacitated. This is drawing from a study of American law. That victims feel virtually incapacitated and have to resort to subterfuges and evasions and minor forms of resistance that typically leave the law unchallenged and unchanged. A fast unto death is not a minor provocation, but the point is that it is not collective or systemic. The inclusion of the fast unto death in this and other stories indicates an awareness of the obstacles to appeal and access to justice that limits individuals' legal responses to idiosyncratic acts. From this, we see a more complicated picture of legal consciousness as it is articulated in these medieval narratives. Next example from Somadeva's Kathasaritsagara, the ocean of rivers of stories. If the River of Kings, the Rajatarangini, purportedly conveys historical events as they occurred, the nearly contemporaneous Kathasaritsagara is explicitly a work of fiction. Said to have been written by a Kashmiri poet named Somadeva for the pleasure of Queen Suryamati, the wife of a king named Anantadeva in the 11th century, this enormous collection draws self-consciously upon an extensive series of stories found in the Mrcchakatika, the Great Romance, an old compendium that boasts of a wide-ranging influence on story literature in medieval South Asia, and that is said, and beyond really, and that is said to have been composed by Gunadhya in Paishachi, a little-known Prakrit. Now, our example from the Kathasaritsagara is a story of deception and financial fraud. This is my favorite story. Perpetrated on an unsuspecting but arrogant Brahmin courtier. The Kathasaritsagara recounts the tale of two con men, Shiva and Madhava, who defraud this Brahmin of his wealth and who devise their plan explicitly with the inevitable trial before the king in mind. At one level, this is a story of two lovable knaves that is both told to warn people against believing the deceitful lies of con men and to expose the perils and blindness of greed. The rogue's actions are implicitly decried, but the Brahmin victim is also portrayed as bringing the crime upon himself due to his avaricious character. At another level, the story is a positively cinematic tale of complicated legal deception transpiring over a long period of time. The extensive planning and the sheer commitment required by the two anti-heroes' actions draw the reader into an intricately woven plot of deception. Shiva and Madhava's charming personalities also compel the reader to root for their success, in spite of the harsh fraud that they eventually commit against the Brahmin courtier. The story opens with just such a charming depiction. They're talking to each other. By now we have robbed this town blind. So let's move now to Ujjain, where we hear there's a minister of the king named Shankaraswamin who is super rich. With the money we steal from him, we can finally come to appreciate the charms of women here in Malava. After hatching their plan, they set out for Ujjain, where Madhava will, along with a host of paid accomplices, pretend to be a noble Rajput, while Shiva will take the disguise of a religious ascetic. Shiva enters the town first and begins to practice the severe austerities characteristic of a holy world renouncer, prolonged meditation and prayer, fasting, and purposeful mortifications of the body. After a long time, Shiva's extreme austerities earn him a reputation as a great ascetic in the community, and the people of the town become devoted to him. Madhava, for his part, then enters the city after this delay, along with his entourage. Settling in, he pays homage to the holy ascetic Shiva and then sends his attendants to the Brahmin minister Shankaraswamin with a gift and the explanation that he has come because his family has oppressed him and that he therefore wishes to settle away from them in this town. With repeated gifts, Madhava is offered an audience first with Shankaraswamin and through him with the king himself. The greedy Shankaraswamin then invites Madhava to stay in his home, where he hopes the Kshatriya will continue to shower him with offerings. Installed then in Shankaraswamin's house, Madhava strategically places a huge vault in his new residence to entice Shankaraswamin with glimpses of a hoard of what turn out to be false gems and jewels contained inside. After several days, Madhava pretends to become ill, and fearing his death, asks Shankaraswamin to bring him a worthy Brahmin on whom he can bestow his fortune. First rejecting a series of Shankaraswamin's candidates, Madhava eventually accepts the advice of a conspiring attendant to invite the now famous and supposedly accomplished Brahmin renunciant Shiva to receive the fortune. Shankaraswamin consents to the plan and meets Shiva at Madhava's request in order to convince him to accept the dying man's gift. Shiva, however, initially declines to accept, stating that he is a mere ascetic who lives on alms and has surrendered all interest in material possessions. But Shankaraswamin coaxes him by raising a matter of dharma, suggesting that one cannot become an ascetic without traversing the ashramas, the stages of life, in their appropriate order, with the householder stage being that preceding that of renunciation. Shiva protests further. He is a devout Brahmin and cannot marry just anyone, but only a proper Brahmin lady. Seeing occasion to profit on the impending death of the wealthy Rajput, Shankaraswamin offers Shiva his own daughter's hand in marriage on the spot. And in the midst of protests that he knows nothing of either women or money, Shiva, of course, consents to the plan. Madhava, in turn, deems this soon-to-be-married ascetic worthy of receiving his dying gift, and Shiva is married and subsequently takes control of the fake fortune, immediately entrusting it to Shankaraswamin for safekeeping. The group lives together for some time, and Madhava progressively recovers from his feigned illness, crediting Shiva's auspiciousness as the cause of his rejuvenation. One day, Shiva suggests to Shankaraswamin that since Shankaraswamin has been such a generous host, Shiva should now pay his own way. Of course, he's a man who has no means of his own other than the fortune granted him by Madhava. So he suggests that Shankaraswamin simply purchase his fortune of gems and jewels in return for a fair price. Thinking that the hoard will be valuable beyond measure, Shankaraswamin purchases the jewels from Shiva with all of his current wealth, as he intended to pocket a profit upon reselling the jewels to another. And he insists that Shiva sign a receipt acknowledging the terms of the transaction. When the cash-strapped minister eventually tries to sell one of the jewels in the town, he is, of course, told that it is fake, made of glass, rock, and brass, as are all the rest of the jewels in the vault. Shankaraswamin confronts Shiva about the fraud, as you can imagine, but Shiva claims that the money he was paid for the jewels is already spent on his own maintenance. That's why he had negotiated the deal in the first place. So as a king's minister, Shankaraswamin takes the matter to the court, where both Shiva and Madhava present their carefully contrived defenses. Shiva first. King, from my childhood I have been an ascetic, and I was persuaded by that man's earnest petition to accept a gift. And when I took it, though inexperienced in the ways of the world, I said to him, I am ignorant about jewels and things of that kind, and I rely upon you. And he consented, saying, I will be your warrant in this matter. And I accepted the entire gift and deposited it into his custody. Then he purchased the whole from me at his own price, and we hold from one another mutual receipts. And now it is in the king's power to grant me help in my deep need. And then Madhava. Don't claim this, talking to Shankaraswami. You are a respectable man, but what fault have I committed in this matter? I never received anything from either you or from Shiva. I had some wealth inherited from my father, which I had long deposited elsewhere. Then I brought that wealth and presented it to a Brahmin. If the gold is not real gold and the jewels are not real jewels, then let us suppose that I have reaped fruit from giving away brass, quartz, and glass. But the fact that I was persuaded with sincere heart that I was giving something of value is clear from this, that I recovered from a very dangerous illness. Key apparently to the legal efficacy of these defenses is the fact that they were delivered with a straight face. The king immediately chuckles and smiles, and then declares that neither Shiva nor Madhava has done anything illegal, anyayataha. Then the whole court, king's ministers and judges all laugh to themselves as the defeated Brahmin minister skulks out of the court. Shiva and Madhava, meanwhile, happily stay on, having obtained the favor of the delighted king. In this story, the narrative emphasizes that the court is bound by the letter of the law, in a way that seemed undesirable in the story from the Rajatarangini. We can speculate that the laughter of the court might even derive from that very inability to do anything in the face of such a perfectly masterminded and strictly legal plan. And this is where we can see a new aspect of legal consciousness in medieval India. The sheer scope of the plan to defraud Shankaraswamin is impressive. A score of people are involved. A huge investment of capital was required to present Madhava with his entourage. Shiva engaged in real and long-lasting austerities to gain a local reputation.
Madhava earned Shankaraswamin's trust as well as that of the king only gradually, and he cultivated Shankaraswamin's greed carefully and slowly. And finally, Shiva went through with an actual marriage to perpetrate the final deceptive transaction. All of this was done in explicit anticipation of the inevitable trial before the king, and every element is meticulously put into place to guarantee the legally unassailable defenses offered at the end of the story. Though clearly the product of a creative storyteller, such an elaborate ruse could make no sense to an audience unless there existed an available and plausible legal consciousness about the sometimes inescapable nature of the legal process. The storyteller deftly creates the complex plot, but he does so with a certain end of the unimpeachable legal defenses in mind. Like the two rogues, the storyteller also counts on the existence of a rigid legal process and the inevitable necessity for the enforcement of the letter of the law to spin his tale. The awareness, even hyper-awareness of the inner workings of the law further shows that the legal consciousness of this medieval author was such that he could imagine a complex plot driven wholly by two laymen's knowledge of the rules of evidence, the nature of contracts, and the circumstances that would be examined by the court. In our example from the Rajatarangini, we saw portrayals of ordinary people's knowledge of the law and legal processes constituted by both a reverence for the law based in a fear of its power, and a disdain for the capriciousness of law and practice, based on the possibility that clever people could manipulate the legal process. In this case, by contrast, everyone involved in the final court scene, with the exception of Shankaraswamin, it appears, is immersed in the law's vision of justice and the apparent limitations imposed by the mechanical constraints of the law. In fact, Shiva and Madhava count on these constraints from the beginning. It is precisely the anticipatory legal consciousness of the two rogues and their self-assurance of the predictable verdict of the court that we see represented this acute form of awareness of the law among ordinary people. Regardless then of whether the king is compelled to uphold the law, as in the story of Shiva and Madhava, or as in other Kathasaritsagara tales, simply chooses to do so, the narratives undoubtedly depend on an awareness of a strict system of legality that was considered normative and binding, an awareness that must have been shared by both the characters in the stories and the audience who enjoyed them. The characters in these stories anticipated more than the mere fiat of the king's authority, that more than the mere fiat would decide their fates. Such an elaborate anticipatory consciousness of the law as the one found in the Shiva and Madhava story is not often depicted in Sanskrit literature, but the fact that it could be and that less elaborate anticipations of the court's predictability feature in all the stories suggests that ordinary people in medieval India wielded variable levels of consciousness of the law and attitudes toward it that mirrored those of other times and places. Some people were wholly ignorant of the law or only knew it to be a powerful institution that one should not cross. Others had opinions and impressions of the law as binding certain actions in irrevocable ways. Many found the law to be a site of arbitrary power against which one could not really fight. Still others understood that the law could be manipulated through a variety of strategies. And finally, a few had the capacity to hold on to the valuable norms of the law while seeing through attempts to corrupt its purposes. If the sovereign's authority was the final arbiter in the royal judgment hall, the king nevertheless was undoubtedly engaged extensively in a web of legality that he simply could not ignore. Conclusions. Studies of the relationship between law and literature in medieval India have to date been largely limited to the question of whether the literary sources conform to or deviate from the religio-legal texts of Dharmashastra. Many parallel terms, phrases, and ideas between medieval stories and Dharma texts show that the stories like the ones presented here did rely heavily on the jurisprudence and legal terminology found in Dharmashastra. However, we think it a mistake to focus on such parallels, because by putting these ideas to work in narrative contexts, they changed both the effect of the ideas and what we may learn from them today. Literary sources contain views of the law that are unavailable in normative, systematized legal texts. Medieval historians have long seen the value of comparing legal and literary sources, and many have now directed their work to the subfield of law and literature. Stories have didactic, psychological, and emotional effects that are difficult, if not impossible, to achieve in systematic jurisprudence. The examples given here are only a small fraction of the narratives dealing with legal matters to be found in the classical Indian sources. We hope future studies will add to the storehouse of information and interpretive insights available through reading these stories with the law in mind. For our purposes, we have focused first on the psychological or attitudinal aspects of legal consciousness that are found in narrative, but not in jurisprudence. At the same time, we have tried to comment upon what Susan Silby, following James White, calls the constitutive aspects of legal consciousness. That is, quote, the role of consciousness and cultural practice as communicating factors between individual agency and social structure, rather than expressions of one or the other. For example, the way in which assumptions or predictions about how the court will behave structure the stories at some level. Through such stories, we find evidence of the mediating role that legal consciousness played, not only in guiding the actions of the individual characters portrayed, but also in influencing procedures and outcomes at the institutional level of the court. Indeed, one notable common feature of the stories is their setting in the court. Dharmashastra texts do portray a king's court, staffed by Brahmin judges, as the normal institutional location for legal matters. But other historical evidence of epigraphy and other kinds of records, both within and outside the text, suggest that many legal matters were dealt with in communal groups and associations beyond the state. The ready availability of these and similar stories appears, however, to confirm the historical practice of trial and judgment in royal courts. Given the frequent reference to writing in the stories, we still have to wonder why so few surviving examples of court records or legal documents survive from medieval India. I would love to have that forged document, for instance, right? On the basis of these stories, however, we may at least say that the king's court was one important social location of the law in this period. Aside from the smaller details of legal consciousness, a general lesson to be learned from the study of law-related narratives in medieval India is the prevalence of a notion of legality. In his justly enduring study of law, Robert Lingat famously wrote, "The classical legal system of India substitutes the notion of authority for that of legality." As others have noted, Lingat has surely overdrawn the line of demarcation between authority in the East and legality in the West. Nevertheless, the clear evidence is quite familiar that is Western in Lingat's terms. Nevertheless, the clear evidence of quite familiar notions of legality, that is Western notions of legality in Lingat's terms, in these stories, is worth some further comment. In the Rajatarangini, the question of legality, here a strict adherence to the letter of the law and to stare decisis, is at the center of both stories. The wise king may see through corruptions of the law and legal process, but he does so in a way that leaves the legality of the applicable rules intact, just not applicable in these cases. Contracts still bind people generally, but the documents and the individuals attesting to them must be upright and forthright. So the legal test in this case has two prongs. The contracts themselves must be valid, and the circumstances of their production must also be legal. In a technical sense, even the story from the Kathasaritsagara conforms to the same idea of legality, even though this is a story more about the moral manipulation of legality. Shiva and Madhava intentionally deceive the courtier, but every one of their actions in and of itself is legal. As a result, both the receipts attesting to the sale of the jewels and the circumstances under which that sale occurred were legal. That an underlying motive to defraud the courtier also existed prior to all these legal actions is crucial for the context of the story and the overall text, but irrelevant for the embedded consciousness of legality that moves the story forward. As a concluding contrast, one might read Narayana Rao's short study of folk perceptions of the law in India as confirming the idea that traditional India had little use for a notion of legality. But the evidence he presents from modern stories and films, and some medieval literature, actually confirms the existence of a different notion of legality that permeated the legal consciousness represented in the folklore examples he worked on. That legality, as Narayana Rao shows, is not geared toward adversarial legal procedure and the power of lawyers. Rather, this notion of legality begins from an awareness that, quote, courts defend the rich, and the system of justice serves those who can manipulate it to their advantage, but gives people, again quoting, a powerful ability to speak against authority for its failure in its responsibility of representing dharma. The consciousness of the law in the stories discussed here reminds us of that found in these folklore examples. Both are grounded in a notion of legality that can be described in its own terms. That consciousness of law and legality is first of all variable in ways that we have pointed out. Within that range, however, it is centered institutionally on the figure of the judge. Rules of positive law are held to have binding effects, even as they are subject also to scrutiny and modification by the court, and/or to manipulation by the litigants. Legal actors fear the injustice that the legal process can sanction and turn to moral appeals for remedy. In all of this, we are in the face of a literarily developed notion of legal consciousness and legality. Moreover, we argue for the likelihood that this literary construction congrued considerably with the contemporary consciousness of legal practice. From the abundant reference to and reliance on such a notion of legality, therefore, we hope that Linga's powerfully framed denial of legality in the classical law of India may finally be put to rest. We can and should learn much more about the history of law in India from literature, not only in Sanskrit but in other Indian languages. We hope that this essay is a first step toward a more nuanced history of legal consciousness and legal practice in medieval India. Thank you.
I've been reading these legal historians over years, such as Legat and also Garrett, and
Sure.
I even own a copy of the introduction myself. The problem that I have, well, it was on sale.
Fire
The problem that
sale.
I have with all this literature is that there's a complete absence of any chronological development in it. And I find this very difficult to wrap my brains around.
Right.
When does this legal consciousness make itself manifest? It's also that you talk about these Brahmins and Sanskrit project their own universe of legality and so on. But isn't it also true that apart from the, let's say, vague use of the word medieval, not necessarily the vague use of the word India, that we have in fact not only no sense at all on how this develops over the course of maybe 1500 years, and secondly that there is a plurality of legal systems in South and Southeast Asia that we haven't even begun to map yet. Because if you go south from Kashmir, well, then you get, for example, completely different legal systems. Even in the Pathan areas, we know from anthropological history studies which are actually very good. The best studies on India, Pathan areas, they have a customary law, which is a very strong notion of legality. And this is very old, but nobody ever wrote anything about it until then the 17th century. So and then there are many other systems of customary law, and then of course there is the Muslim input. So there's an enormous history there. And also, why would the Indians not have consciousness of legality? Are there any societies? No, that don't have that. The fact that you have a society, ipso facto, evidence that there is some kind of notion of justice or legality. So why would India not have one too? Is there any?
I don't know. Ask Robert Lingat, right? I mean, this is the problem. But people cite him over and over again, right?
But I don't think he says that. Or at least I wasn't aware of it.
I gave you the quote, right?
Yeah, but that's
Authority.
not
India has authority, but not legality.
Yeah, but don't forget that this is a translation from the French.
Yeah.
And this is not necessarily correct. He's a lawyer himself.
Yeah.
And he knows what legality can mean in different contexts. And I wouldn't dismiss his notion so quickly. I found his work very careful, but
Of course.
But it's not social history.
No, it's not social history in that sense, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure the evidence permits the social history that would be satisfactory to a historian, right?
That's why I've been looking for this. I think it's just not possible to write it. Perhaps.
Right.
The political literature is actually quite helpful. For example, on the Indonesian Adat, there's a huge literature.
Right.
And also other customary systems of law. Even if you study today's system of Pakistan, you can
Right.
learn a lot from that. You can apply it.
Right, but insofar as you're, in a sense, accusing is the wrong word, but talking about, the ambiguity of medieval and of India and things like that, there's an ambiguity in the word custom that is very problematic, and also in the word anthropology, right? It's a very deceptive thing to project anthropological notions back historically, as if they are, cumulative evidence of a long-standing historical truth. You agree?
Yes, but if there are multiple customary quote-unquote systems, to what extent can you prioritize this Sanskrit base?
You can't.
Exactly.
Yeah,
But
you
that's
have to
what-
start with the local. That's right.
People who study the Indian system always tend to do, because
Not me.
But your examples were from two, if I understood correctly, two Sanskrit collections.
Definitely. Okay. So I agree. I agree. So the procedure, you and I agree, I think, on what a responsible historical procedure would have to look like if you were really going to write history. Okay. You would have to start out with what you're calling customary systems. It's my opinion, having looked at some of these things, that you can make connections between them, right? That none of these places exist in isolation, that the customary norms in Patan are going to be not that dissimilar from, places, I mean, in some places, in some aspects to how, let's say, procedures are done in Kashmir or even further south, right? The amount of tax or the precise amount to be paid for a document, that might vary a little bit, but that you have to do such things, maybe not so much. Anyway, we can talk about that, but we agree that ideally you start from the huge plurality and diversity of systems as they're available from other kinds of datable historical sources. And then you build up from there, insofar as possible, commonalities between these systems to try to discern whether there is any commonality at all.
I also detected a sort of corporate attempt in your presentation to show that there is a 12th century kind of breakthrough into legal consciousness, just like it was the case in Europe.
No, that's interesting. I hadn't thought. You're right, though. That this would give that impression.
The intention,
One of the examples I deleted is from the Mrcchakatika of Kalidasa, which is probably in the 5th century AD, which I think exhibits some features of the kinds of legal consciousness that we're talking about here. So it takes things a bit further back. But your remark about chronology is the usual. I mean, I have to give the usual Sanskritist defense, which is that we just don't know. I would love to have chronological stuff, and I can in some cases date the texts, but whether the texts are always accurate measures of anything more than the textual history is a complicated thing, right? Whether the legal consciousness in the Kathasaritsagara is indicative of some more generic breakthrough in India. I doubt it as well.
So
right.
That's why I was thinking, is this the intention of the selection of your text over the 12th century?
Nah. Our basic point is simply to say that medieval Indians had a notion of the law and had a notion of legality.
How could they not?
But you'd be surprised how many people think that they do not.
Okay, yeah.
That's the problem. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's the repetition of a truth. Maybe it's misunderstood from Linga. I think the French still is pretty strong on that. I mean, it's the same word as far as I know, but it's still, even if it's been misunderstood through the English, this is how people have taken it. That it's authority, which comes with the notion of capriciousness.
Well, poor Linga, I would say.
Maybe Derrida did him a disservice, but.
Right, let's open it up. There's a question over there.
Well, my question was a little bit outside of your paper. So I was thinking about Arthashastra, which is, of course, goes to different topics. But have you studied how much Kautilya has touched these similar legal issues regarding the running of a state?
Yes, of course. Mm-hmm.
So with this a little bit earlier text, it would be interesting to know what kind of legal consciousness they have.
So as a matter of heuristics, right, as a way to investigate or isolate a problem, I specifically avoided what I was calling systematic texts of systematic jurisprudence, right?
Yes.
The Arthashastra is not a work of literature, right? It's a work of Shastra. So these are part of a genre of what we would call Katha literature, story literature. So what I'm interested in is eliminating from our, for a specific purpose, eliminating the question of what the Shastras say, whether it's Arthashastra or Dharmashastra or some other Shastra says about law. What can we tell from just looking at the genre of Katha, right? Maybe extending that into broader notions of kavya also. So that's why I didn't talk about Arthashastra in this particular context. Of course, you can find all kinds of interesting things about the law in the Arthashastra, but it wasn't part of our particular task here.
For example, how I continue just a little bit.
We have another question here, and I want to make sure everybody gets a chance. Yeah, Karen.
Hi, Karen.
Thank you for such a fascinating talk, and
Thank you.
it's really
Yeah.
fun to revisit these texts.
Well, it's partially for you. I know I never have stories for you, and here I got some finally. So.
So, but I'm thinking of it as a folklorist might, which is written text as just one precipitate from the vast sea of oral versions.
Right.
And also the whole, this issue of looking at legal consciousness in terms of social conventions, but we are actually also looking at narrative conventions in these cases.
Right.
And the narrative conventions around the stock figures of the king, usually there's a prime minister too, right? And
Right.
curiously missing and curiously missing here.
Yeah.
And then the courtiers and then somebody coming, and that goes through such a big swath of Indian folklore and
Sure.
literature. And so, I was really interested in what you're doing in looking at the logical processes, right,
Mhm.
that are underlying the way the narratives develop.
Yeah.
And it seems that maybe looking at the various versions might also help you see what continuities there are across time and also across space. So I think of the tale, I don't know if you've had a chance to look up these in the tale type or motif indexes.
I have not looked. Okay, I
Because,
could check. Sure.
It's probably a motif.
Mm-hmm.
Changing the letter on a piece of paper. I'm sure it's a motif.
Right.
It's such crazy things that people assemble, where you see every single folklore that was recorded with that motif in it.
Right.
And you can, then follow it in that. In fact,
Right.
I know quite a few folk tales where that tiny little
Some little
mantra or
thing.
something is
Mhm.
switched off, and then
Yeah.
the whole story goes off the
Right.
rails from there.
Yeah.
And also the issue of how stories really come from situations where something is unusual or extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
Because if everything goes the way it's supposed to go, it doesn't really make a good story.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And so it becomes a little bit hard to reconstruct ethnographically for that reason.
Right.
Even though one can see the categories and the processes.
Sure. I agree. So you're talking about a fundamental problem of taking literary representations as indicative of a social reality, right? We did our best to try to hedge our claims about this, right? On the one hand, I think what we're trying to appeal to is a sort of common sense that literary representations don't come out of nowhere. They come out of some kind of social experience, no matter how many conventions they employ, no matter how many motifs they rely upon. And it's only to that extent, in a sense, that we're trying to claim that it only makes sense if people understand and can appreciate that this is something that could happen, or even if it's only in the imagined world of literary, enjoyment, it's something that people would resonate with them. We would love to say more than that, and maybe we've gone a little too far in that direction in terms of trying to say that that it doesn't make sense without some measure of corresponding historical reality. But I hope we haven't overstated the case too much. And the motif index suggestion is a really good one, just to bring home that there may be very typical conventions at work that are used in lots of different places. Yeah. Thank you.
If I may just add something quickly. I keep thinking John Grisham.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering, to what extent this is just a really good story. And I think, okay, why do people enjoy reading a book like that? And
Yeah.
there's this awareness that there's this thing called the law, and stuff goes on that we don't understand. But
Yeah.
people that know the law, they can find these little things. It's always similarly hinged on this little thing, right? Like you're a lay person who's never going to know, but somebody who really knows the law.
Right.
And then, the good guy wins, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so is this really just a medieval version of...
Yes. Absolutely. This is John Grisham in medieval
In
India.
Sanskrit.
Yeah, because
The contrivances are there, right? There's certain things that a practicing lawyer who's reading that book might go, oh, this
Yeah, right.
is really, it's
Really,
this
yeah.
section where it's really pushed it too far.
Yeah.
And yet the overall, I like it because the overall effect, Grisham doesn't work if it's, about Martians and their weird legal procedures.
Yeah.
It has to connect with an actual, some measure of legal practice
Yeah.
as it really exists, right? Even though it's sort of fancifully reconstructed and very carefully stitched together so that it works perfectly.
There is a short question about Shastic literature. I agree that there are problems with Shastras. They are very esoteric texts, and they are written by certain Brahmin specialists. Do you think that this is the reason why, or is this the reason why you outruled the Shastric texts in your research?
It's because every other paper I've written has been about Shastras.
Yes, so it has been already made this kind of study. The others have
It's simply because it's a new area of interest for me that I just haven't read enough of these stories, and my friend happened to share some with me, and we were trying to explore a new area. But the Shastras, I love them. They're my friends. So.
That's so sad, Don. That's so sad.
The Shastras are very, very problematic. For example, in architecture, you find things which have nothing whatsoever to do with reality.
Right.
And because and they violate all the rules. For example, in the iconography,
Sure.
you find rules in the Shastras which you cannot find anywhere in India.
Right. Well, my teacher Patrick Oliver once said, the Shastras are like a blueprint, but you could never build a house with them.
They're very problematic.
So.
And
Yeah.
question at times arises why they have been written.
Yeah. Well, you and I can talk about that.
They're your friends, so you have problematic friends, Don.
Of course, all my friends are problems, or else they wouldn't be my friends.
Thank you very much, Don.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.